The tribes of the area have claimed that the feces, the alligator feces found in that site, are funerary objects. So they're basically saying that they decided to bury their remains with.
Today's guest is Elizabeth Weiss, who is a physical anthropologist and professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at San Jose State University, and is the author of the book On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Elizabeth, as the title of your book is On the Warpath: My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and the Woke Warriors. Who are these woke warriors, pretendians, and people that have tried to cancel you, or you've written this whole book on this escapade?
So basically, what's happened is I was a professor at San Jose State University, and I was a physical anthropologist. My area of expertise is study of skeletal remains, and I curated the largest single-site collection of pre-contact Native Americans in west of the Mississippi, the Ryan Mound. And I used that collection to reconstruct past lives, to understand bone biology, to get students involved in research, and also to invite scholars from around the world to study the collection. And I did this for nearly 20 years, and the university was pretty happy with my work. I got glowing evaluations from the chair and the dean. They were, for my promoting the collection, including taking photographs with skeletal remains. We even had one year at one of the Southwestern Anthropological Association meetings, a tour of the collection. So everything was going pretty swimmingly until I wrote a book called Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which was critical of the repatriation movement. And repatriation movement is the movement that takes skeletal collections, mainly pre-contact now, because all the historic collections have been repatriated, and gives them to modern tribes, supposedly because they're linked, but they're not always really closely linked or linked at all. And so I had been critical of the repatriation movement since I've started becoming a physical anthropologist, even as a graduate student. And I had been writing about the issue for years. But my last book, Repatriation and Erasing the Past, struck a nerve, and it had a huge cancellation campaign to try to get the book removed. On top of that, I took a photo of me in a skull, which was perfectly normal. Nobody had any problems before with that. But in this heightened environment of wokeness, where everything is about identity politics, this was not seen as kosher anymore. And so my department chair and my dean and provost all decided that I was doing things that were inappropriate, abhorrent to them. And they basically jumped on the cancel culture bandwagon and decided that they were going to try to get me out of the university. Instead, I sued them for basically academic freedom issues. And that is what my book's about. So the woke warriors are the non-native administrators, and also a lot of young scholars who wanted to have the book Repatriation and Erasing the Past banned. They wouldn't call it banning the book, but they wrote to the publisher saying that the book should be withdrawn. I call that banning, that's what they wanted. And then the Pretendians are some of the Native American tribes, even who were in the region, who, even family members would say, actually, we're not member of this tribe, or this tribe never existed beforehand, or this is a, you know, um, I do think that there's a very clear distinction between people who mistakenly think that they are Native Americans, family folk, folkloric family tales, versus people who kind of know that they're not, but have decided to take on this mantle of being a Native American to get some benefits from it. So that's what I call a pretendian. They're not mistaking, they're pretending, right? And I don't maybe I mention it in my book on the Warpath book, where that term it was first used. But I cannot remember now, and I did not coin that term. That is a term that had been already being used, also being used by other Native Americans who were upset at seeing non-Native Americans trying to claim, Native American identity for benefits. Um, and then, of course, the Indians are the Native American activists. Some, not all of them are Pretendians. Some of them are Native American activists who want to destroy our ability to reconstruct the past because they don't want things about their past to be known, such as evidence of violence, or a lot of people don't know this, but Native American tribes engaged in slavery before European contact. So these are things that they don't want to be known. I remember reading, and when I was writing Repatriation and Erasing the Past, reading some of the materials that is written by the U.S. government in collaboration with Native American tribes that is given to school teachers to share with their classes. And it was, one of the lists of things was Native Americans, didn't have any lawyers because they didn't need any. They didn't engage in warfare, and they never created the atomic bomb. It's like that kind of thing. And they had 500 years or 5,000 years of peace before the Europeans arrived. And we know that this is not true. So my battles were with those groups. Now, I actually know quite a few Native Americans who are aghast at the repatriation movement and the movement to try to erase history. And so I always try to make a distinction between those people who are repatriation activists or Native Americans who are in the repatriation activist movement and others. Just like I would say, there are scholars who are non-woke and there are scholars who are woke. It's the same thing, and making distinction between pretendians and people who are just falsely think they're Native American.
In your first book, I believe, was it Repatriation and Erasing the Past, you and your co-author predict that in 50 years' time, all research collections will be lost forever. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed. And I guess I was just shocked to think that you'd have all these collections at these universities, and they were then just essentially being taken away and reburied without really any evidence. As you talk about, if a native tribe says, hey, we have claims to this, there's really no quote unquote due process. It's basically like, oh, hey, we said this. It doesn't matter if you are an anthropologist. We don't believe in your Western science. We have our own, belief system here. And if they want to take claim to it, they can essentially take all these bones, all this, I guess you could say like the data of thousands of years of human history. And you even mentioned in the book how a lot of your classmates had to go to Europe in order to study because there's just not that many collections in the United States. I found that part to be absolutely shocking.
Yeah, and we wrote Repatriate. Jim Springer, who's my co-author, and I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past to come out on the 30th anniversary of the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. And so it did. It came out in 2010. And sorry, 2020. Lost a decade there, 2020. And so we wanted it to come out on the 30th anniversary, and it did. And one of the things we noticed was that throughout the years from 1990, when NAGPRA was passed, to 2020, you see this chipping away at what we call the compromise that NAGPRA was intended or had intended. So initially, NAGPRA was written as a compromise to get the collections were clearly linked to a tribe repatriated, and that all other collections would still be curated and be able to be researched. And so they even had terms like culturally unidentifiable, which is a collection where you don't know which tribe that collection would belong to. And it may not belong to any modern tribe. Some tribes have died out. And so this was seen as a protection for the field of anthropology and archaeology. That has fallen by the wayside for multiple positions. One thing is the affiliation, the link between the past and the present has been deteriorated. The requirements for that have been deteriorated. So initially, it was meant to be, a preponderance of evidence, and that evidence could include genetics, geology, historic documents, tribal oral histories, so a lot of different things, archaeological artifacts, right? But now how it is being read is that they've added a new category, which is called traditional knowledge or traditional Indian knowledge. And they say that knowledge must take deference over everything else. And, you could say, well, so you have 10 pieces of evidence, 9 point one way, and traditional knowledge points the opposite. And that's one that we should defer to. And this was one of the ways the NAGPRA compromise failed. Another way is they have now removed the culturally unidentifiable category, so everything's identifiable. And then the third way that this has been deteriorated is, and this happened after we wrote the book actually, is that the almost everything is now considered repatriatable, if that's the word, in the sense that when NAGPRA was written, it was written that human remains, sacred objects, and sacred objects was clearly defined as something that is required in a Native American traditional ceremony, religious ceremony, and objects of cultural patrimony, and funerary objects. So funerary objects are objects that were intentionally buried with an individual, so that there was this intention that it was buried with the individual. So if I die now and somebody says, oh, well, we want to bury Elizabeth with her first archaeological trowel, right? That would be a funerary object. The dirt that comes on top of me is not a funerary object, right? So that's, and object of cultural patrimony is an object that belongs to the group and cannot belong to an individual. So the Statue of Liberty is an object of cultural patrimony in the US, for example. A replica of the Statue of Liberty that you buy in a souvenir shop is not. And so what's happened is that these categories have been completely, these definitions have been completely ignored. And if you look at the NAGPRA repatriation notices now, you'll see that everything is going back. So recently, for example, photographs, negatives of photographs of cave art has been claimed as something sacred. Um, Animal feces and soil has been claimed as um, as funerary objects. There's a site that's a Paleo-Indian site, so very ancient. Paleo-Indians are 7,500 years old or older. And the thing is that this site happened to be in a marsh. It's in Florida. And the tribes of the area, which were not around in 7,500 years ago or more, have claimed that the feces, the alligator feces found in that site, are funerary objects. So they're basically saying that they decided to bury their remains with shit. Literally, this is not a funerary object. And people might say, well, what does it matter if they do that? Well, it matters because one thing is that data such as coprolites, so fossilized species, soils, can be used by geologists, paleontologists to reconstruct the environment, not just the past lives of the Native Americans, but the whole environment. And once you let things go, it will never end. So what we're seeing is that now replicas are being requested for repatriation. And the museums and universities aren't saying no. They're saying yes, yes, you can take these back. And so let's say you're a Native American artist and you create a mask for sale, for commercial sale. Now this is considered an object of cultural patrimony or sacred object. What does that do to Native American artists? It robs them of their ability to create their work and make a living. And so that's another aspect. But we set the date at 50 years, given what had happened by 2019. I would say now it's not 45 years yeah, 5, 6 years have passed, so it's not 45 years. I would say it's already destroyed. In California, nobody is doing native Californian archaeology using actual skeletal remains. They might be using still some data that they collected previously, but newly collected data is not being done and not being researched. And finally, the other aspect of this is that it's spread not only to research collections, but teaching collections, and it's spread ideologically that you can only get permission to study remains or write on past collections by having permission from the tribes. And so we've seen some very odd articles coming out of places like Science, where they come to conclusions that the data is not leading them to, that the collaboration is leading them to. For example, just the other day, there was a story about Marco Rubio mentioning the origins of cowboy culture and how it came from Spain and so forth. And then there is, the other one, Cortez, she basically said, oh, how ridiculous, there was cowboys in Mexico already. But we know that the Spaniards brought over the cowboys. They taught, then others started riding them, including the Native Americans. The research that shows that there's no evidence of riding beforehand, and that there's no evidence of horses that were ridden before contact. But yet, a new study about maybe 2 years old now, published in such a prestigious journal of science, concludes that because horse remains that were butchered showed evidence of riding at a site that was pre-contact for that site, that's evidence that the tale, the myth that these Blackfoot Indians rode before contact is true. When obviously the most parsimonious answer is that the horses escaped from their Spanish owners, and the Native Americans found the horses and they butchered them and ate them. That's, so it's leading us to wrong conclusions, and those wrong conclusions may be minor when it comes to something esoteric like riding horses, or may be major, like trying to deal with the origins of the high rates of diabetes in Native American communities.
I was reading one of your papers, which is called The Study of California's Past is Dead and Reburied. And you also talk about this in your book as well. But basically, your quote is that anthropology degrees, especially those with biological anthropology and archaeology courses, may prepare students for forensic anthropology graduate programs, which will result in terminal degrees that lead to careers that help solve crimes. So essentially, if you take away all of the bones, all the evidence that allow these, everyone's seen a show like CSI Miami or whatever, and these students need actual courses to teach them how to identify victims, whether it be in 9/11 or some terrorist attack or whatever. But if you're not going to allow any of these universities or students to have actual bones and actual real life use cases to hone their skills on, eventually we're just going to have a bunch of students that know nothing, and then they'll end up being a coroner, or there'll be a forensic analyst, and there'll be some expert witness at some trial. Everyone wants to talk about the slippery slope, but it seems like we're already sliding head first down the slippery slope, maybe in 1990.
Yes, I think we are, and I think that this accelerated in in the most recent years, like 2020 to now, because California actually passed a couple extra regulations or additions to their NAGPRA Act. So California Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that includes that the effect of using teaching collections. And so teaching collections are being repatriated now if they may have Native American remains. Now, anybody who's taught with a teaching collection knows that teaching collections are a mishmash of any bone you can get your hand on, in the sense of you have bones that were, for example, donated from medical students. You have bones from surface sites that were maybe collected 100 years ago. You have bones from the East Indian bone trade, and everything in between. And what these teaching collections are is, I could teach anybody all 206 bones in the body of a full skeleton, but that's not how life is. Sometimes you get just a fragment of a bone, and you still need to be able to identify what bone that is, whether it's human or non-human, whether it's historic or present or prehistoric, and various other aspects. And so that's what we teach with these teaching collections. And because a lot of them are very fragmented, when I taught human osteology or forensic osteology, the first quiz I'd have like full bones. Second quiz, they'd be maybe like 3/4 full. By the time the final exam came, it'd be like, an inch here and an inch there, and, challenging students to identify these things. And, even like some students even sent teeth that they lost, like, or got pulled for our dental collection. So it's a real mishmash. And that's what makes it a great teaching tool. And there is no cast or no cast collection or video or virtual collection that can bring that to you in the same way as real bones. There is no substitute. But even if there was a substitute, so many times people have said to me, well, why don't you just scan the bones in 3D, print them out, and then give the bones back? The reason why this is not the solution is because now the Native American repatriation activists are actually asking for scans for replicas back, repatriating them. They can't be repatriated because they were never belonging to them in the first place, but they're using that term. And so we're losing that too. And when I was in the midst of the many cancellation attempts at San Jose State University, one of the people said to me, one of the professors said to me, well, you know what? Actually, we shouldn't be showing any skulls or bones, regardless of the bones ethnicity, because it may upset Native Americans to see these bones, even if it is not Native American. So you then go from, okay, well, what if we have no Native American remains in the collection? It's still verboten or taboo. And we're seeing that in museums, the removal of human remains from display cases has extended beyond Native Americans and to all collections. And it would not surprise me if casts are next. And I would go further, and I would say it would not surprise me if non-human remains are next. One of the moves that the University of Arizona here in Tucson has done is that they have actually accepted the Native American repatriation activists' claims that some animals are imbued with human spirits and therefore should be treated as human and repatriated. So next time a forensic anthropologist, picks up, next time a cop picks up a dog bone, which has, literally happened to me, like cops called me up and said, we found a bone, somebody found a bone in their yard that we think it's human, but we're not 100% sure. Can you come take a look at it? And I look at him like it's a dog bone. And they might say, how can you get that confused? If it's just a foot bone, it does take it does take somebody to learn the difference between a dog, a Great Dane foot bone, which is almost the same size as a human foot bone. So, so what we don't want to get into the situation, which is totally possible, that some cop picks up a dog bone, calls a forensic anthropologist who's never experienced real bones, and they can't tell the difference. And people say, well, the knowledge is there, so how can it be lost? We've lost a lot of knowledge in the past, and I don't see that wouldn't be possible in the future. If you think about all the languages, for example, that have gone extinct, that's lost knowledge.
As we're on this topic, in the book you talk about Kennewick Man, which is the oldest known human remains found in the United States of America, which is somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 years old. And it was discovered in the 1990s, I believe 1996. And then it was reburied in 2017. So the oldest known human in the United States has been reburied almost a decade ago. I was shocked to hear that.
Yeah, and if you think about this, so Kennewick Man is one of our Paleo Indians I was talking about, individuals who are 7,500 years or older. And there are a dozen of those around. Some of them are even older than Kennewick Man, like Spirit Cave is the oldest mummy, which is about 10,000 years. But they all fluctuate around that same time period. And they're such an interesting group because not only do they not look like Native Americans from after 5,000 years, so they don't look like they're affiliated or related to modern tribes, but they also don't all look like each other. So Kennewick Man was initially mistaken for perhaps a what you would maybe call a Proto-Asian or Caucasian, but not don't think of Europe as much as think of the Ainu, the Japanese indigenous peoples. And then you have down south in Brazil, Lucia, who is 8,000 to 9,000 years as well, and her skeletal morphology looked more like an Australian Aborigine. So they vary greatly from each other, but they have had evidence of a Kennewick Man. I looked at his CT scans of his leg bones and the measurements of his leg, like this humeral head, and he was a really robust guy, almost like in between modern human and Neanderthal in robusticity, in bone strength and broadness. And so this is a very unique individual. And what happened is, Kennewick Man was found in 1996 eroding out of a riverbed. So he wasn't in a burial, really. He was, he wasn't buried intentionally. He had died and then been covered and, then eroded out of riverbed. And that's just another, misconception, is people think that every skeletal remains that is found was actually in a burial, as opposed to, some of them were just buried over time naturally, not in an actual intentional burial. And initially, Jim Chatters was the one who looked at him and thought he was actually a homicide victim, but he saw a little glint in the hip bone and thought, "What's that?" And then they took an X-ray and they found out that he had an obsidian arrowhead point in his bone, so obviously not modern. And then they tested his age, and they found out he was, at that time, I believe, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, discovered in the continental U.S. And the Umatilla and the tribe, and maybe another tribe, Umatilla is definitely one of them. They immediately claimed him as belonging to them and wanted to repatriate him, rebury him. But a group of scientists said, "No, we're going to sue." And they sued. And they eventually got the right to study him. But in 2016, President Obama at the time signed an executive order to hand him over to the tribe and have him reburied. Now, what's interesting about this also is that when Kennewick Man was found, and when the Army Corps of Engineers dumped tons, literally 2 tons of dirt and rocks and so forth on the site so nothing else would be found. And over the time, one of the bones was replaced. So that's another weird thing. But if you look, the final straw with the reburial came with DNA studies. The first DNA study was unsuccessful, but then the second follow-up DNA study by Rasmussen et al., which I believe was published in Nature, it worked. But if you look at the actual results of that DNA study, it shows that Kennewick Man was most closely related to Native South American tribes, not North American tribes. And so, yes, there was a genetic link between some of the Washington tribes, like the Colville, the Umatilla, but that wasn't the closest link. And anybody who knows genetics will tell you that everybody is related. So you can't say, well, there's some genetic continuity there. Of course, there's genetic continuity with me and a mouse, but you wouldn't say, oh, well, therefore it's, I should be able to rebury all the dead mice or whatever. It's like this kind of absurdity to not say, well, actually, the data show that Kennewick Man was most closely related to other tribes in South America and therefore should not be reburied. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. And if you read the popular reports on it, you would think, oh, wow, Kennewick Man was closely related to these Washington state tribes. The anthropologists got it wrong. But if you actually look at the data, the graphs, the actual article, you'll see that the anthropologists did not get it wrong. Kennewick Man should not have been repatriated, and it's a great loss. And what's even greater loss about that is that it opened the doorway, it opened the floodgate, I will say, to the repatriation of every Paleo-Indian that is discovered. There is no end in sight.
Right now, we've discussed a lot about the 1990 Act, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. And in that, of course, is the word Native Americans. So when you're talking about all these bones that are being taken out of these universities, museums, other collections, is it strictly Native American? Or is it other bones as well? Because if anyone's done road trips around the U.S., the oldest buildings in the U.S. are in New Mexico. Like the oldest church was something like 1400. So I guess that part of New Mexico would have been part of Mexico. So they're not really Native American. Would that be more like, say, Mexican? So would you be able to go in there and do research on that?
So what's interesting is that many of the people who criticized me for my perspective on repatriation and criticized repatriation and erasing the past, calling for its removal from library shelves and so forth, and the depublication of it, actually conduct research in Mexico. And so they act like, well, that there's no problem in the U.S. doing research, but yet Mexico has a lot of archaeology right now, and I just finished writing an article, a book chapter on this, on the display of human remains. And one of the interesting things is that in certain areas of Mexico, there are mummy museums, there's ability to study skeletal remains and mummies, and they take pride in this. And it's ironic that there have been American and Canadian anthropologists who have gone down there and have tried to convince them that they shouldn't be doing this, that they should take these remains off from display. And so it's this, the anthropologists are, trying to tell the Mexicans what they should be doing with their history and with their prehistory. And I think that that's kind of like neo-colonialism, which is, crazy. But in a way, it's a falsehood to think that all cultures think that the only way to treat a body respectfully is through burial. And that, there are lots of different cultures and lots of different religions where the body is treated separately as the consciousness or the soul or, the spiritual aspect. And, they have areas of research that are, in Europe, going to field school in Europe, you can still do bioarchaeology, study of skeletal remains in the archaeological setting. But this is changing as, you know, people start saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't show these bodies either. Maybe we shouldn't do this research either. And one of the problems with America, with the US being such a huge, having such a huge um, of, footprint in academia and in museums and universities, so in both, is that sometimes other places will start mimicking the US and be like, it's just like what they say about California, how California goes, so does the rest of the nation. Well, it's kind of the same thing. And so we're starting to see in the UK collections being withdrawn from display, that in museums, human remains collections being withdrawn from display, and um, getting access to skeletal remains to study becoming more difficult. So although it starts with the Native Americans here in the US, I think it's spreading, and that's very worrisome.
In the article I mentioned, the study of California's past is dead and reburied. You mentioned, this is kind of a quote, but you say that when researchers need to go abroad to study collections, students and professors with less means may be unable to choose this area of research, and research that may help modern people, like forensic research, becomes skewed by looking at only European remains, which I would imagine European remains would mean white people. So by trying to say that you want to protect minorities, you don't actually research minorities, you only research white people. So doesn't that just continue the cycle of colonialism and whiteness, whatever, bullshit wokeness you want to say?
Right. And I think that that's one of the issues. If you look at certain donated body collections, like and University of Tennessee has one. There's a one in San Marcos, Texas. They're like, we don't want any more white males over 50. We need to diversify our collection, because you're only going to get like certain features and certain diseases and certain traits, and you're not going to be able to learn about true diversity. One of the things that I've noticed when I'm teaching about skeletal anatomy over the years is that students expect that the diversity ends at our skin level, and it's just not true. So they'll see something that's different and they'll be like, oh, what's wrong here? And I'll be like, nothing's wrong. It's just a variant, a variation that is a normal variant, but we need to know that. And people may be like, well, what harm does that do? And it basically will lead people to draw wrong conclusions. For example, prior to in-depth research on skeletal remains, people sometimes mistook holes in the foramen that are naturally occurring, called holes in the sternum that are naturally occurring, that are called foramen. They sometimes mistook that for a bullet hole, and these are just like naturally occurring holes that sometimes some people have them, some people don't. Some of them have them in the middle of the sternum. Some people have them on the xiphoid process at the end. And we need to know these things so we don't come to wrong conclusions. Um, there's variation in the number of ribs. There's variation in the number of vertebrae. If you think that, okay, well, lots of people have back problems, and you don't know that there's normal variation, you may take a look at the back and say, oh, this person has an extra lumbar bone. Maybe that's causing the back pain. But if you looked at collections with extra backbones and without, and have their medical history as in donated body collections, then you see that really it's not, that doesn't relate to back pain. So you would be drawing the wrong conclusions and performing the wrong procedures as a doctor, perhaps. So I think that what we're seeing is when we lose this data, we lose what I call the beauty of skeletal diversity, that, diversity is not just skin deep, it goes down to the bone. And we don't want to start thinking, oh, well, everything looks like a model. Um, and, another example is the sutures on the skull. It used to be thought that sutures on the skull were very good indicators of age, and now we know that's not true. That some people's sutures close young, some people stay open their entire life, and it's actually one of the poorest indicators of age that you can use from the bones. So there's one suture from the sphenoid to the rest of the skull, which is the sphenoid. It makes part of the bottom part of your like eye sockets, and that is a good indicator of age, of a certain age. But it tells you something that, okay, we see the skull, all the sutures are closed. Oh, must be very old, and it might not be, or vice versa. And this leads to misidentification in forensic cases. Some of the research that has been done in the past for in Texas is about border crossers and how to identify the difference between skeletal remains from Native American, prehistoric skeletal remains from Native Americans, and people who died crossing the border. This is important research, and yet we're, basically shooting ourselves in the foot if we lose collections and cannot move further ahead with this type of research.
You keep mentioning about how we're losing these collections and whatnot. What is kind of the impetus in the book? Like, one, you just kind of mentioned the whole savage Indian, like, where you don't want that story out there. Like, oh, we're peaceful, we're environmentalist, and that's really not true. I mean, they were constantly warring. I mean, constantly fighting with each other. You even mentioned they never even invented the wheel or learned to write. And so how do we even know how we can track this history if we don't even have a written record? So we're supposed to go on some elder that learned some story, whatever. But then also in modern day, where a lot of these Native American Indian tribes can have casinos, you need to be federally recognized to be able to get the casino. So there's a lot of money that also comes along with it. And so you have that aspect of it. But then I also just kind of look at like how anthropology, is predominantly female, predominantly, quote unquote progressive. And we've had the massification of universities. So you just get a bunch of people in university that, 50 years ago never would have been able to hack it in university. And it's just a lazy way out. It's a lot easier to be like, well, I'll take an elder's word for it as research versus me having to get down and actually use stats and actually have to dig stuff up. And so it's like part of it's like, well, it's just laziness, it's incompetence, there's money, there's so many different factors. I mean, as someone that's been in this space since the 1990s, how do you see it?
I think that all of those factors and a couple more are absolutely playing a part. Guilt over past quote unquote sins of anthropology, what I would call presentism. So judging past people by today's standards is part of the reason why people have guilt over this, and therefore, they want to atone for these sins by being a better anthropologist by not doing anthropology. Another aspect of it is definitely this kind of it's easier to listen to elders' perspective than actually do the work. I think this is very much true, not only with this kind of work, but also with the hard sciences. You get, especially females, and not just females, but especially females who sometimes decide to do like astrobiology or higher order math as a study, and then they find out that they can't hack it, and so then then their research becomes females in math. It's like, well, that's a lot easier than actually doing the math. And I'm taught, and like, obviously, there are females who can do these things, but there are some who go in it for the wrong reasons, and the wrong reason being, oh, I want to be a female astronaut, as opposed to just like, I love space and I want to be an astronaut, right? But I want to be a female astronaut, with the emphasis on the female, on the identity. I think that that's part of the problem. I mean, I think about the stuff I've studied at university at intro level, and I can tell you, I'm not smart enough to be a physicist. That doesn't bother me. I would never decide, oh, I'm going to do physics because I'm a female and I want to be a female physicist. There are things that I don't understand, and there are beyond my ability to understand, and I'm okay with that because there are things that I enjoy, and nobody can do everything, and it's not an issue for me. But then there's the other thing that really kind of annoys me, and it has annoyed me for a long time, is people who study what they study because it's a part of them. So we get this like the anthropology of self. So, sometimes you'll have like, oh, I'm, like the queer archaeology interest group. They study all things queer and archaeology, trying to find evidence of queerness in ancient civilizations. And then you look at who's in this interest group, and they're all queers. And I'm like, and I've always thought, isn't it much more interesting to study something that is not of you, but something outside? And I've had students who like, and I've known other professors who have said, I have a Black student, and they're trying to convince this student to study, Caribbean archaeology, but they really want to study Vikings. And why shouldn't they study Vikings? If that's their interest, of course they should. And so this kind of anthropology of the self drives some of this kind of deterioration of the field, because it means that people are not just in it because they're interested in the field. They're in it because they're interested in themselves and trying to view the past through this lens. And, I became an anthropologist basically for a couple reasons. One, I love anatomy. I just love, and I particularly love skeletal anatomy. I think it's a thing of beauty. I think that the understanding the form and function of bones and how they work to have a person be able to engage in life, how you can look at skeletal remains and determine things like sex, age, disease. I just think the whole concept of skeletal anatomy and reconstructing the past, and also seeing the ties between us and other animals in an evolutionary sense, is just fascinating. And so that's what drove me to anthropology. And my favorite chapter in Charles Darwin's Origin of Species is his chapter on morphology, the study of form. And so this is what really drove me to anthropology, is that this love of anatomy coupled with kind of in a sense, romantic desire to know what the past people's lives were like. I say romantic not in like a rosy romantic way, but more like I wonder what their lives were like on an everyday basis, uh, lives that were in some ways similar to ours and then in other ways different. And I now live in Tucson, Arizona, and sometimes I'm taking a desert hike and I think, wow, what would this have been like 5,000 years ago? What were the people who were walking around doing and thinking when they were walking on this beautiful land? And those are my reasons. They're not reasons about me trying to identify myself in these past peoples. I'm not trying to atone for any wrongdoings or trying to make myself feel less guilty or doing a field that I can't really comprehend. It's a pure intellectual interest of mine. And I think we need more of that. And the way to get more of that is to make universities intellectual again.
In your book, one of the interesting parts where you're discussing when you're teaching at the was it University of San Jose State in California, and there was something like 10 or 20 Native American students, and then they reclassified what actual Native American was so they could have 500 students. Turns out it's reclassified by the Department of Equity, inclusion, diversity, whatever, DEI department. And then at the same time, you're talking about poverty, about how all these college students are food insecure. And so, how do you classify food insecure? Well, you went to your friend's house, got hammered, spent the night. You weren't actually at your house. So, in addition to being food insecure, you're also homeless because you spent a night away at your house because you drank too much. But ultimately, the university collects all these extra dollars because now we have these food insecure students. We got all these extra Native Americans. And it's really just the bureaucracy. We've all read these articles about how Stanford and how Harvard have more admin than students. How the hell do you have more admin than students? So you have 1,000 students, yet you have 1,200 admin. I mean, this makes no sense. But when you start looking at it, like these admin, like they have to do anything they can to protect their cushy ass jobs. So they're constantly trying to claw money, whether it be the federal government or grants and whatnot. So you kind of want to talk about this, Elizabeth?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's again a slippery slope, and it's again like with NAGPRA, with the concept of what is a funerary object, what is a sacred object. It's ignoring real definitions and broadening them out so much that they mean nothing. Homeless, I mean, I can't remember the exact definition that they used, but it was something like if you sleep on somebody's couch twice in a row, you considered, and they don't use the term homeless anymore, of course, a person who is experiencing homelessness or whatever they say. Um, Food insecure. If you go to a steakhouse and you can't afford the steak you want, you might be food insecure. And this kind of expanding of the terms is seen throughout academia. Another example, is turning sadness and defining it as depression. People get sad. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're mentally ill. It's just bad things happen. And sometimes you're sad about it. That's okay. And so that's another example of this. And I think that it's in part because there is this vast bureaucracy, this army of people who make their living like this. And, it's like, oh, we have to sign up more people for the food stamps. And I think it's ghastly that we're teaching our college students that the way to get ahead in the world is to define yourself as poverty stricken, and and insecure and to take any freebie you want. Because you know what? Freebies aren't free. It's the taxpayers who are paying for it. So when they expand these definitions to include people who really aren't food insecure or who really aren't homeless, basically it's taxpayers who are paying it, and um, it's kind of a ripoff. And it's, you know, I can't remember exactly where I wrote this, but I took a deep dive into what we call the poverty narrative, that students are poor. And one of the interesting things is that we used to have the term hunger, you know, basically trying to stop hunger in America. And before that, we had starvation, trying to stop starvation or malnutrition, undernutrition. But now it's food insecure because hunger and starvation have been solved. And so but the people involved in that bureaucracy and in those fields, they can't say, hey, victory, there are no more hungry people in America who are literally not hungry because they can't get food. Sure, there are people who are starving, mentally ill, anorexics, or people who are the odd person who is starving for other reasons, but we've solved the hunger problem. Isn't this reason to celebrate? And it's not, because they just then redefine it to ensure that more and more people fall into that category to save their jobs. And it's kind of like a self-licking lollipop. It never ends, and it's continuously self-gratifying. And I think that this is one of the big tragedies that we teach our university students.
This is actually an interesting quote from your book. And you say that SJSU is not a particularly expensive school. Tuition and fees at San Jose State University sit at around $7,992 per year for over 90% of the students who are in-state students. And minimum wage in California ranges from $16 to $20 per hour. So at a $20 an hour job at 20 hours a week, you're looking at about $21,000 a year, which seems fairly reasonable. Everyone always hears college is so expensive, blah, blah, blah. I guess you're kind of saying that's not necessarily true.
No.
And, so what's going on with that section of the book?
I think the thing is that people conflate or join the expense of college with living expenses. But newsflash, even people who don't go to college have living expenses. It's not college that is those living expenses. It's living. And so they have to have these living expenses. So when people go get student loans, they're not just getting student loans for the tuition and fees and books. They're getting loans to cover their living expenses. And therefore, they don't have to work, and therefore they can hopefully graduate quickly and pay back the loans. I took loans like that. I did not work throughout all my years at school. What I did was what a lot of people did was during the school year, I took as many courses as I could. Then during the breaks, I worked. I worked at a coffee shop for years, for example. And during the breaks, I also lived with my parents. So if you look at it that way, you can say, well, actually, the cost of the university isn't that expensive if you strip out the living expenses, and everybody needs living expenses because, you have, if you're not in college, you need to eat too. And so I think that that's where we get these outrageous numbers. And then people are like, oh, well, I have $40,000 loans for just a bachelor. And it's like, well, one thing is that's actually pretty easy to pay off if you get a job. But the other thing is that if you don't want that much loan, just work, you know, and don't take all that loan out. I mean, that's the take-home message. Now, do I think that universities can be made cheaper? Absolutely. Get rid of those administrators. Get have less things on campus, a smaller footprint, so to speak, in the sense of, do we really need, fancy, um, you know, almost water park like pools and so forth? Can we reduce it? Absolutely. And so I'm not against. Could San Jose be $3,000 a year? I think so. But I'm not. But I think that it's like, there's a real problem um, of the bureaucracy and the things that students want on campus. Many times they vote for these things. For example, UC Santa Cruz didn't used to have sports, and students voted to have certain sports teams at the and that this knowing that this would increase their tuition. So, and they decided that it was worth it for them to increase tuition to have sports. So that's another aspect. So I'm not saying that it can't be cheaper. I definitely think it could be cheaper. And I think it should be cheaper because I think a lot of the things that the money is spent on is quite honestly Mickey Mouse bullshit. But I don't think it's this, oh my goodness, students are paying $40,000 a year in tuition and fees to get a women's study. Well, they don't have women's studies now, do they? A gender studies, degree is also an exaggeration. So I think it's you have to take both sides and say, look, there's this. It's actually in between. We can make it cheaper, but it's really not that expensive too.
Well, I think the point right there was when you get that gender studies, and of course it's not women because who knows what a woman is in 2026 or whatever. But the fact is, when you get this gender studies degree of the, Mohican language of, whatever, what do you actually do with it? So when you are 40,000 in debt and you're working at Walmart or working at Starbucks, then you have a difficult time paying that degree off.
Unfortunately, what most people do with it is they go straight back into the university system and become one of those annoying administrators. So it's like, conveyor belt.
Yeah, it's the make. I've always talked about this in podcasts, but it's essentially a make work program because what can you do with this gender studies degree? You can't do anything. So you have to go into some DEI department. You have to go into some company as HR because it's the only thing that you actually are, quote unquote qualified for.
Right. Yeah.
One of the things I found interesting is how you basically were pushed out essentially, and you were tenured. We always hear that tenured professors are essentially unfireable outside of like you going in and punching out a student or doing some heinous crime. But the fact is, you were pushed out as a tenured professor. So I guess what are the tactics? You talk about how, you could have access to this collection. In this particular case, as an anthropologist, you have access to this collection of bones. They can cut that access off, cut off your access to X-ray or whatever technology, and you're not able to do your research. You don't do your research. Maybe you're in breach of your contract. And I would imagine this is possible. Again, you're an anthropologist, but I would imagine this would be pretty doable regardless of what department you're in. So it doesn't
Yeah.
really seem like you're actually that safe, even as a tenured professor. I think what saved you is the fact that you were, what, like 18 or 19 years into your career. If you would have been, I don't know, 10 years into your career, I feel like your outcome would have been significantly different. But you want to kind of
Right.
talk about your case and talk about tenured and how they can push you out, how they can mess with your schedule, research grants, things like that.
Right. So, like, one of the things is that tenure does protect you quite a bit, um, but it's not a complete shield, right? So, when my cancellation attacks came, um, I was fortunate enough to be able to sneak into a webinar that my chair was talking at and was hosted by my dean about what to do when your tenured colleague is branded a racist. And in that, they basically outlined what they had planned to do, including perhaps giving me an evaluation that would say that I was um, can't remember the term now. It was like incompetent,
Incompetent.
right? Yes. Yeah. And that this is a step to lead people to, this is a step that you can be used to get even a tenured professor fired. Now, couple things that saved me. One thing is I got legal help right away. Pacific Legal Foundation stepped in. I reached out to them and they stepped in. And so they were warning my university from the get-go that they better not fire me and that they better not take retaliatory actions. So that was one of the things. And um, my case was complicated by a Native American issue, um, as as people reading the book will see. But the thing is that even though they couldn't, they weren't to the point where they would be able to fire me because my next review wasn't up for a few years too. I can't remember. I think I had just submitted my review. So the next review would have been like 5 years from then. Um, so But what they did was they tried to squeeze me out by locking me out of the curation facilities, not giving me access to other materials to conduct research, like other collections. Um, basically, talking about not giving me any funds for research or for speakers or for, you know, and stuff like that, which would have led to a bad 5 years, and therefore would have boosted their claim of incompetence. And they could have probably ended up kicking me out. I'm not sure that they would have done so because I took legal action right away, but they would have made my life not as, yeah, pretty miserable as an academic. I mean, one of the things is that I take everything fairly, in stride. So I wasn't that upset because I kind of, knew what was going to be happening and I knew that I could handle the stress and I knew that various other aspects. But and I had, if I did lose my job, I knew I wasn't going to be financially abandoned because, we were financially fairly secure. So I did have some advantages on that. But in the end, I settled my case because even had I stayed, it wouldn't have been the job that I had wanted. And that was in part because they were pushing me out, but also in part because the field has changed so much that maybe had none of this happened, maybe I would have taken early retirement anyway. You know, I I cannot imagine me being in San Jose or any university as a physical anthropologist with down the hall from hundreds of skeletal remains and not being able to study them. It's a tragedy, And I think that it would have been just kind of an unbearable situation. So in a sense, um, it is difficult to fire a tenured professor, but they can do it. And I was, I'm not sure would say I was pushed out as opposed to, basically, um, made the decision that even if I stayed, this would not be the place I would want to be.
One of the things I find interesting is that so you're like a physical anthropologist, and then there's also the cultural anthropologist. And so I think both of these are kind of like, say, the physical anthropologist is straddling the line between, say, hard science, and then you'd have the cultural anthropologist, which is clearly a social science. It's like and I had a professor, Mark Horowitz on. He's done a lot of research on social scientists. He's a professor at Seton Hall University. And he said that if you know a social scientist professor's political affiliation, then you can predict the actual research outcomes pretty much at 100% veracity. But then it's interesting because physical anthropologist, I believe they call it now in a lot of universities like a biological anthropologist, but it's more of a hard science. But at the same time, he's done studies on this as well, and you can pretty much predict the outcome based on their political affiliation. And so you're talking about how the field has changed so much. I mean, what was it like when you first got into physical anthropology? How is it now? How did you see the change? Was there any particular year or any particular event where you're just like, this was what completely changed physical anthropology?
I think Kennewick Man really changed physical anthropology in the sense that it broadened the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to things that were clearly not meant to be in that. So I do think that so fairly early on in my career. But the other thing is that physical anthropologists and archaeologists were kind of hesitant to initially to sign up on to NAGPRA. And I think that has really changed. Archaeologists being some of the worst in terms of that. And part of this is because they know that if they're not for repatriation, they will not get any cultural resource management jobs. They will not get any access to collections and so forth. So that was one of the changes. But I also think that there has been an abandonment in of the concept of continuity between humans and non-humans. So when I was, and I went to, I went to UC Santa Cruz as an undergraduate, but you can't get any more like PC than that in a way. Kind of hippie school. And I went there because I loved the nature of the campus. And so I also am not into sports, so that was like, oh, well, no sports, lots of nature, great. And so, I really enjoyed my years there. And but we were, there was this kind of emphasis in anthropology that humans were just on a continuum when you consider like what to study and the use of skeletal remains. And I think that has broken down so that people now think humans are unique. So a human skeleton needs to be treated differently than a non-human skeleton. And I think that has broken down. And I believe that's partially because we have kowtowed to animistic beliefs of Native American activists who think everything is sacred. And it doesn't matter if it's a human or non-human, it's all sacred. So they have adopted the continuum, but in the other extreme. And so anthropologists are kind of like, okay, well, humans are sacred, but so I think that there's issues around that. But I also think that um, the um, you know the issue of race has played a huge role. The concept that race is just a biological concept, which it's not. Sorry, it's just a cultural concept, which is not. It's also a biological concept, and the whole gender issue, abandoning the concept of male female. These all have changed the fields drastically, and so and even changing from the term biological to physical anthropology. Now, physical anthropology is a form of biological anthropology, but it is literally dealing with the physical aspects of bones. So biological anthropology can also be DNA, genetics, right? So I think that just abandoning that term physical has not been a good thing either.
So I had this podcast recently with a law professor from Fordham University in New York, and he wrote this article called Woke Will Not Go Broke. And I've always said you go woke, get rich. It's not go woke, go broke. It's go woke, get rich. And as you're kind of discussing this stuff, it seemed, his kind of point was like a lot of these policies since Trump was in office, you just kind of go underground, you change the names of the departments instead of DEI, you just call it sustainability or whatever, right? You just kind of make this stuff up. And at this point, the anthropology department is so far gone. Do you think there's any way that we can actually kind of like salvage these departments? I mean, the fact is, if you have a bunch of people that are probably incompetent in the first place, and then it's just easier to be like, well, 2 foot Blackfoot said this versus actually going out and doing the research. I mean, any lazy person, I mean, if you're making, I don't know, 6 figures as a college professor and you can zoom 2 foot Blackfoot and he's like, oh yeah, like we're going to do this. You're like, perfect, let's do that. And then you can actually nowadays with technology, you can sit on your yacht or your boat in the San Francisco harbor talking to 2 foot Blackfoot. I mean, why would you even go out into the field when you can do all your research by Zoom? And then you want to like basically be as vindictive as and mean as possible to create barriers to entry for other people so they don't take your job sitting on your yacht in the San Francisco harbor. That's just the way I look at it, but maybe I'm wrong.
I do think I think that not very helpful, but I do think there's a little hope. And because it's anthropology and studying the past and skeletal remains, mummies, is so absolutely interesting. Much more interesting than just listening to a origin myth. Much more interesting than trying to horn in queerness in the bog people of Northern Europe or so. And that will always people will always be drawn to these kind of things if we allow them to be. That's why museum exhibits with human remains are so popular, because it's so fascinating. And so I think that there might be a backlash at some point where you say, you know what? I actually do want to study Vikings, even though I'm not at all related to them. Or, I really do want to go into the field in Africa and find the next Lucy. Because in the end, that's much more rewarding and fascinating than just sitting at home and doing Zoom or, you know, um, you know, teaching things that are not even true. So I have hope. Not a lot, but I still have hope. Um, and in part because I do think that it is it is such a fascinating field. We want to know what really happened. And if we can get people who are driven by intellectual curiosity into some of the universities and then see them through to professors, then that could save the field. And it might not be a lot at the beginning, but maybe little by little we can claw back. And it won't be the same because we've lost so much, but we can still have more excavations, search for new things, um, ensure that more collections are not lost. And heck, maybe NAGPRA will someday be repealed. And I still have hope.
If you had a child that was going into university, would you recommend they went into anthropology? Would you have hope? Would you push them towards a different major? On a scale of 0 to 10, I can't imagine, based on this conversation, that you would be recommending anthropology. Would you recommend something else? What would you say?
I don't know. I mean, when I was starting school, my parents didn't really recommend anything. They basically were like, what do you think you're interested in? And that's it. Yeah, they weren't pushing anything. And so I think that I'm not a mother. I don't have children, but I do think that I would probably not steer them away or towards it. I'd let their interests guide them. And I would say the same thing to students. If you're interested in anthropology, go study anthropology. And if it's not how you think it should be, try to get the information in various ways. Take field school in places that they're still doing actual field school, like in Poland, right? Consider, a year abroad somewhere to, write the papers that you think should be written. Read older works that are still valid and try to claw it back.
And as you mentioned earlier, where you're saying that there's a lot of students that were going to Europe, is there any particular country that's the worst? I mean, is the United States bad with what we were discussing with the 1990 law? Canada, we always hear about how
Canada is probably worse than the US. Right. Australia and New Zealand are very bad.
Right.
And the US. Those are the main ones. The UK is getting a little worse than it used to be. But definitely, Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand are the real problem nations.
So where would you go if you were studying to be an anthropologist in 2026? What country would you recommend?
Well, I would probably recommend, certain areas in South America are still very popular, and still quite open, to anthropological studies. Like we talked about Mexico, but there's also, Argentina. One of the interesting things about South America is that the tribes don't have as much clout, so to speak. It's more about nations than tribes. So there's still some good research coming out of there. I would say some of the countries, especially former Eastern European countries, have quite a lot of archaeology. I mentioned Poland, but I also believe Romania. And so that's another area. So I do think that there's still work to be done, and I personally think that if I was starting out now, I might not have ended up doing as much Native American remains research, but more other research. And ironically, I did my postdoc and I collected some of my PhD data and did my postdoc in Canada, where you already back then they were reclaiming castes for destruction through repatriation movement. And this was like in 2000.
Today's guest has been Elizabeth Weiss, who is a physical anthropologist and professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at San Jose State University. We discussed her book today on the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. So 2 final questions for you, Elizabeth. 1, where can people find your book, get a hold of your research? And secondly, leave us with a final thought.
Okay, you can. I'm on Twitter or X, I guess, at Weiss Unburied, but I think that's it. And you can get the book at Amazon or any other online retailer. And final thought: let's not give up on anthropology. It's too fascinating a field to let it go die in DEI.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.